Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C. on a cloudy autumn day with the pleasure of talking to my friend and IRD board member, a distinguished Methodist theologian and professor at Asbury Seminary outside Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Ken Collins, who has an important new book just out called Generous Divine Love, the Grace and Power of Methodist Theology. Ken, why did you write this book?
Oh, that's a wonderful question because I wrote it out of a sense of gratitude and thankfulness. I've been at this for a while, obviously. I came out of a different tradition, so I came to my Methodism and have been with it now for getting close to 50 years. And I have developed such a rich appreciation for the tradition. In other words, it has been such a blessing to my own life and that of others that writing this book, Generous Divine Love, was my way of saying thank you, thank you, thank you to the tradition itself. Yeah.
Ken, if you met me walking down the street and I asked you what you do, and you said Methodist theologian, and I said, what is Methodism? What makes you different from all of the other Christians in the world? What would you say?
I would say that Methodism is going to stress two things preeminently within the context of the Christian faith. Obviously, we're Christians. We have much in common with those from other theological traditions. But in the Wesleyan Methodist household, you're going to see an emphasis on the importance of holiness, of actually really being holy in the warp and woof of life, and then a great stress on grace. Methodist Wesleyans are constantly talking about the grace of God, what a wonderful gift it is, and how we are really empowered to live this life towards which we're called. So I would share those sort of things and say, knowing the kind of culture that the questioner is participating in, that theology makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. There may be a common misunderstanding in our culture that theology, whether it's Wesleyan or Reformed or Roman Catholic or whatever, is irrelevant, a thing of a bygone age, medieval nonsense, that sort of thing. They should quickly realize, to use the language of William James from the early 20th century in his Varieties of Religious Experience, that theology has cash value. It has practical cash value in the living of our lives. And so I would want to approach it from that point of view, to really share with the questioner that you have something at stake here. You do. You have something at stake here. There's a good, if you will, a good to be had.
So you're still talking to this stranger on the street, and he says, oh, I've attended a non-denominational church. I've been to a Baptist church. I've been to a Presbyterian church. Or I've even been to an Anglican church. What's different about the Wesleyan tradition that I haven't already experienced?
Yeah, well, in a sense, I think it would be principally about holiness. And for many people, we would have to help them with that because they wouldn't know what that means. That's not a word that is often used on the pages of the Wall Street Journal or heard in media. And so it's going to take a little filling out. And so I would express it as indeed John Wesley expressed it. It's about love. It's about holy love. And holy love is really descriptive of who God is. We Christians and Methodists talk about God is love. John Wesley said love is God's darling attribute. So we put an emphasis on the holy love of God. And a way of understanding that is that the holy love of God is, when we receive it, it's what makes us beautiful as Christ is beautiful, humble as Christ is humble. Yeah.
So the average Christian, maybe this man in the street, or even most Methodists might say, well, let's talk about holiness. It sounds very intimidating. That sounds like that's for very special people. I've never known anyone like that. How could I possibly achieve or work towards or receive holiness? How would you respond?
Well, I would respond as Wesley himself responded, both John and Charles, when they were ministering throughout England, that when people responded in a curious way to their preaching, John Wesley, in a way distinguished from George Whitefield, would gather up the harvest, so to speak. And he would place those folk in a class meeting whereby they would begin to take up and learn the disciplines of the Christian life. And so to that person, that man or woman on the street who has an inquiry, how is this operationalized, if you will? How is this possibly fleshed out, in the warp and woof of our lives? That's going to happen in a communal context, something like the class meeting for Methodists, but and then also in the communal context of the church itself, and not apart from the means of grace. In other words, the church is rich in ministrations, means of grace, scripture, prayer, Bible reading, sacraments, etc. And it's actually to participate in these means of grace that we can open ourselves up to be transformed by God's grace. And so, one has to be willing, of course, to participate in this life. And so that's always, an option. One, of course, could say no, but if one does open oneself and is humble enough to participate, in this group experience, in the means of grace, I think over time they will see some very positive results.
And so Methodists are Catholic little c. They do believe in the church. They believe in the sacraments. They have liturgy. These are some other central elements to Methodism, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, Methodism, is a Christian tradition, just like Presbyterianism or Anglicanism is a distinct Christian tradition. We are the church, where the Word of God is properly preached and the sacraments duly administered. But there is a Methodist difference. There is a Methodist difference. I mean, just take Wesley, both John and Charles, in their own 18th century environment. They were both good Anglicans, although some, might question how good an Anglican John Wesley was in later life, as he's violating parish boundaries and doing a bunch of other things. But John Wesley believed that more was necessary. In other words, you think of being an Anglican in the 18th century. I mean, you live a rich church life, you attend church, preaching, sacramental life, service to the poor, prayer, a number of the means of grace. Put all that in place, and John Wesley wants to add more. He wants to add more, and this represents the kind of intentionality that's in Methodism towards holiness. So what does he add? He adds responsible, accountable fellowship in the class meeting, and then later on, voluntarily so, if so desired, you could enter a band, which would have, even greater depth and, honesty in terms of one's walk in the Christian journey. And so Wesley believed that more was necessary beyond the usual ministrations of the church. So there's a kind of intentionality to Methodism, which I think is very important, because Wesley wanted to make sure that those who responded to his preaching were gathered up and that they would remain serious disciples of Jesus Christ over time. See, that's the key issue, over time. No doubt, George Whitefield was the greater preacher, and Whitefield would come through like a blaze of glory. There'd be lots of excitement. Many people would come to hear George Whitefield, but then George Whitefield would move on and he wouldn't gather up to harvest. And so they even had a conversation towards the end of Whitefield's life, John Wesley and George Whitefield, and Whitefield admitted that John Wesley chose the better part, because Wesley could point to thousands upon thousands of people who had been gathered up, and they remained. They did not fall away. And why did they remain? Because they participated in the infrastructure of Methodism in general, and in particular in the classes and band meetings, which allowed for face-to-face relationships, accountability, fellowship, the emergence of love. That's the right context.
Over the weekend, I was talking to a friend who works at a Lutheran Missouri Synod seminary, and she's herself non-denominational, but she knows I'm a Methodist and sympathetic. And she says she talks to the students there, the young men, and she's trying to tell them about sanctification. And they chafe at that often and say, well, that's works righteousness. We're saved by faith. What is the Methodist response?
This woman, she needs to read my new book because, I show how these gifts, and they are gifts, the gift of becoming holy in the new birth, or the gift of becoming entirely sanctified in what the Methodists call Christian perfection. Okay. So one of the things I would mention to this woman is take all the insights that you have in terms of the Continental Reformation, let's say Luther, okay, that we're justified by grace through faith alone, okay? Wesley, of course, was well aware of all of those meanings, but watch what John Wesley does. He does something new. He says, exactly as we are justified by faith, all those Lutheran meanings, exactly as we are justified by faith, so are we sanctified by faith. Faith is the condition and the only condition of sanctification, exactly as it is of justification. So to this woman, I would say, just as the forgiveness of sins, in other words, justification, because that's what justification is, the forgiveness of those sins that are past, just as that is a gift, therefore to be received by grace through faith alone, so too is initial sanctification in terms of the new birth, and entire sanctification also a gift, therefore to be received by grace through faith alone. So Wesley, carries it over to holiness as well. So this woman, therefore, should be open to receiving the gift of holiness, because that's what it is. It is a gift, and it can be received by grace through faith alone. Yes.
She would like your answer because she does believe in the importance of sanctification, but she did ask me, what is this Christian perfection idea that seems unattainable? What is your response?
The issue of Christian perfection, and by the way, Wesley used a number of different phrases to describe this reality, though I must confess, his favorite seemed to be Christian perfection. I mean, he talks about entire sanctification, uses other rhetorics, but he does come back to the language of Christian perfection. And it goes back to the issue of sin. And so we'd have to have a very honest discussion, between us all, between this woman and myself or yourself, about sin. And the kind of discussion is necessary is one I don't often hear in the American churches. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for the Methodists. What am I driving at? Well, there is actual sins, plural, the kinds of sins we commit, sins of omission and commission, sins in thought, word, and deed, inward and outward sins. Okay, that's one whole class of sins. And that relates to the issue of justification and the new birth. But the woman has raised the question now in terms of Christian perfection. And that relates to not actual sins, plural, but it relates to that corruption of our nature that yet remains even in a child of God, even in a child of God. So Wesley, for example, will write, sin remains in a child of God, referring to inbred sin, this ongoing corrupted nature. It remains, but it does not reign. In other words, it doesn't break out in the committing of actual sin. So I would ask this woman, first of all, to consider the twofold nature of sin. In other words, we're going to have to put a number of things in place first before she can understand the reality of the very question that she has raised. What is Christian perfection or entire sanctification? Because it doesn't relate to the issue of actual sins, of omission, commission, inward, outward. It relates rather to a sin principle, inbred sin, the carnal nature, that remains even in a child of God. Now, Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox are well apprised of this. They're very familiar with this whole area. And so we have commonality with those traditions in talking about the ongoingness of corruption, especially in terms of our Roman Catholic friends. Someone who is familiar with the Lutheran tradition, we'd have to have probably an extensive conversation about this, but that work would be necessary before we can start talking about the power of God's grace, the gift of receiving cleansing, because it is a gift. It would be received by free grace, as John Wesley clearly taught, by grace through faith alone. Yeah.
So is it accurate to say that Christian perfection from the Wesleyan perspective does not entail necessarily perfect behavior, but a perfection of your overall disposition or the renewal of your sinful disposition?
Oh, it's definitely not a perfection of behavior. That's for sure. We know that. And it's not a perfection of performance because, and here's why, due to ignorance and due to mistaken judgment. So, for example, I may judge some woman to be worse than she actually is. That is my mistaken judgment. In a sense, I've done her harm. I have devalued her. And I've done so out of ignorance and mistaken judgment. And so it's not a perfection of performance because it goes back to Wesley's definition of sin as a willful violation of a known law, that sort of thing. That's what Wesley's going to call sin, properly speaking. Now, there is, of course, what we call sin improperly speaking, which would be any violation of a known law of God, whether willful or not. And the question would be immediately, in light of the two considerations I've already raised, who could be so free? You'd almost need perfect knowledge and perfect judgment, not to commit sin that way. In other words, an unwillful, violation of a known law of God. That who could be so free? And so when Calvinists define sin as any violation of a known law of God, whether willful or not, they are perplexed when Wesleyans say, we can be free from the guilt of sin, from the power of sin, and from the being of sin. And they argue, well, who could be so free? And so, yeah, there's going to be a conversation that needs to be had here.
Speaking of Calvinists, you wrote a very interesting piece for Firebrand recently on the commonalities between the Wesleyan and Calvinist perspectives.
Yes, I think there is actually a lot of commonality between Methodism and Calvinism, and John Wesley himself noted it, as did the Methodist conferences. John Wesley said on one occasion, he's in a hair's breadth of Calvin, and at the conference, they said that they have come to the very edge of Calvinism, and they did. They did come to the very edge of Calvinism. Now, we might not recognize that in our current context today, in the 21st century, the way Methodism and Wesleyism plays out, because we do not stress free grace and giftedness the way that John Wesley and Charles did. We're very much in cooperant grace understandings, divine and human cooperation. Now, John Wesley has this, of course. He has it in his sermon, on working at our own salvation, and God works, therefore you can work. God works, therefore you must work. And so there's a place in Wesley's theology for cooperant grace. But then there's also free grace and giftedness that would have to be factored in. What's been stressed in the 21st century in Methodism and Wesleyanism is cooperant grace, and that makes us good dialogue partners with the Eastern Orthodox and with Catholics, but maybe not so good dialogue partners with Lutherans, Calvinists, and others. And so I wrote this piece because I'm well acquainted with Wesley's writings and the Methodist conferences and what they said. And they stressed the free grace of God, the giftedness of salvation, so much so that they were within a hair's breadth to the very edge of Calvinism. And that's true, and it's true. So I tried to show the areas where there is a lot of similarity between Calvinism on the one hand and Methodism on the other. We too have a rich understanding of free grace. We too proclaim justification by grace through faith alone. We also say, and Wesley continued the Reformation by applying free grace not simply to forensic themes like justification and forgiveness, but to the participatory themes of holiness, initially so in the new birth and entirely so in Christian perfection. Again, exactly as we're justified by faith, so are we sanctified by faith. Faith is the condition and the only condition of sanctification, exactly as it is of justification. That understanding of free grace operative there was richly understood by John Calvin. We have lots in common with the Calvinist tradition. This current century has forgotten it.
Ken, you have a copy of your book within reach?
It's available up on Amazon. I don't have a physical copy yet. I've got it electronically. I went mad dash through the electronic copy, make sure everything printed out okay, and it looks good. It looks fine, but I'm still waiting for my hard copy. I love to mark books up, write things in the margins and stuff like that. So, but I should be getting mine in a day or so.
Generous Divine Love, the Grace and Power of Methodist Theology by Dr. Kenneth Collins. Ken, thank you so much for a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.